Good afternoon. Is this on? Yeah? Okay. Oh, now it's on. Okay. Welcome to the new 21st Century Museum. Are we making them better or are we worse? We're not going to have presentations at this session. I will, however, introduce the panelists now. Oh, I forgot to say who I am. I'm Judith Dobrzynski, your moderator. As I introduce the panelists, I'm going to show you a couple of slides of their domains. So Susan Taylor is director of the New Orleans Museum of Art and the former director of the Princeton University Museum. And this is what her museum looks like. Michael Govan is the director of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, former president and director of the Dia Art Foundation. It's hard to show you what Michael's domain is. This is the Ahmanson building, which dates to '65, is that right? This is their new BCAM. This is their new, inside the new BCAM. This is the new Resnick building. And at least the first building, Michael wants to tear down and start again to build something that looks like that. Richard Olcott is the design partner in Ennead Architects, and he's worked on the designs of many museums, including the Anderson Collection at Stanford University, the Yale University Art Museum. I don't have all of these here. And currently, among other things, he's working on the Peabody Essex Museum expansion. Jerry Saltz, whoops, sorry, didn't mean to show that yet. Jerry Saltz unmakes museums. He doesn't make museums. So he wants to talk today, among other things, about MoMA. And so I brought in a couple of slides of MoMA. Okay? I think that's all we have to show for right now. So the topic, as I said, is art museums, which began, as you know, in the Renaissance as showcases for the treasures of royalty, popes, and wealthy art patrons, and they've been evolving ever since. By the time they got to the United States, and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts was the first, generally considered the first art museum, which began in 1805, they were cultural cathedrals, often in Greek Revival or Beaux-Arts style buildings. Row upon row of galleries. You've been all of them. Much more recently, I would say, museums expanded and hired so-called starchitects who began designing buildings that made statements. And often the outside was more important than the inside. People would come and visit the outside building. They didn't necessarily always come back to see the inside. But now, the art inside. Now we may be at a new inflection point. Museums, I think, are changing in nature. And we may be moving to an era in which architects have to design museums in which living artists or the audience are the people that must be served. So that's the question we're going to explore today. The format is very open and free. I'm going to begin by asking each panelist one question. They have 4 minutes to answer. They know that. And then we'll open it all up to my questions, your questions, and try to have a lively discussion. Susan Taylor. Your museum, as we saw, is a beautiful Beaux-Arts building that dates to 1911, but now you have plans to reconceptualize it. Why? What's wrong with it, and what kinds of spaces do you need that you don't have in the current building?
Well, I'd like to say first there's nothing wrong with it. It's a beautiful Beaux-Arts building, much in the spirit of how Judy described those traditional buildings with galleries en filade. It's located in a park, and there's a long alley that leads up to it with a monumental staircase as well. So it embodies the traditional American approach to art museums at the beginning of the century. The most significant change, I think, for us in New Orleans were two things. One was Katrina, and the other was 2008. And the opportunity to reimagine a museum in a 21st century context was an open opportunity for all of us to think more broadly about what a museum means to a city. And for us in New Orleans, there were three primary factors. One was the sort of visitor-centric experience that we felt was important in terms of engaging our publics. And that operates on many levels. It's an educational initiative, it's a technology initiative involving our audiences in ways that reimagine and reconsider how the collection is interpreted. So that's one component. The second was the changing role that the art museum needed to have in our community, which had really required that we rethink how we engage with our publics. And I use the plural publics because there are many different constituencies that we needed to serve. So the museum for us became a convener, a cultural convener, a place where people could come together around the idea that the visual arts could lend themselves to broader topics of cultural importance and topical interest. So to have a museum that thought about itself as a convener of all of the arts, film, dance, theater, and to be supportive of those new forms of art that were growing in the city was something very important to us. We also have an outside, which being in the South, we have access to the outside, although you really don't want to be outside right now in August where it's over 100 degrees. However, the outside space becomes an opportunity to engage our audiences and animate those spaces in relationship to the arts. So we have a broad plan to engage the audiences with the front of the building. We have a sculpture garden that is currently 6 acres with an idea that that can spill over into other spaces. So to create an opportunity for transparency and accessibility for our audiences to engage with the objects outside, drawing them in as well. And then the third component that is probably is the driver for all of this are the collections. So we have permanent collection galleries traditionally orchestrated around a great hall. And the idea was that we really needed to change how we presented the collections. Our permanent collection galleries are over 80% of our space. We wanted to reconfigure those collections so that we presented a history of art, but within that history, we're able to connect audiences to specific pockets of strength or areas that we thought would be of interest. And then to begin a program of more frequent rotations. We feel that the collection is a resource that can be used continually. And to that end, the education initiative, am I still okay?
You've got
Okay.
5 minutes, 5 seconds.
The education initiative plays off the collection because it's the one constant. So to engage education with the collection was one of the driving forces.
Okay, great. Michael, you have an even greater opportunity to redefine the 21st century museum because you want to tear down that Ahmanson building and most of the rest of the campus and start afresh. So what does the Museum of the Future look like to you?
Well, yes, there are 4 older buildings, and they were built in '65 and the '80s. And the main reason to replace them is that they need hundreds of millions of dollars of work to rebuild them. And I love converting old buildings into new museums. Done that north in Mass MoCA and south at Via Beacon, but old museums don't necessarily make good new museums. In the sense that we've changed the way we visit museums. I think museums have changed just in their function. And so the idea is to start from scratch for the collection museum and to be able to do things you couldn't do otherwise. And to Susan's point, a lot of what people want to see is collections better utilized. You know, the traditional thing is you'll have a collection space and an special exhibition space, and 75% of the people or 80% of the people will go to the special exhibition space, and you've got your billions of dollars invested in your collection. And so it seems like we need to use our collections and learn to present our collections in ways that we've learned to make exhibitions. So the idea is by creating a new building, you can do a lot of things that you couldn't do otherwise. We plan for it to be very transparent and accessible, very flexible to move things around, things we can't do. And also, it'll be all solar powered, zero energy, and it will be very indoor-outdoor, which in California is a really good thing. So the reason we're doing it is less to make a statement. If we're making a statement, it's really just about changing the way people visit museums. And for LA, the biggest thing I think is this, and it's important everywhere, is that audiences are changing. Like the demographics of the United States are changing, cities are changing. LA is one of the most diverse cities like New York on earth. And we need our programs to really address and work with those living communities, not just as dead cultures, but as living cultures. And so, again, museums will change, just to say they'll keep changing. If the history of art is 35,000 years long, the history of museums is a couple hundred years. We're just babies, and you should never equate museums with art. Art is something different. Museums or a frame. Art will go on maybe beyond museums and around museums and are not always contained by museums. So it is a frame, and I think we're actually learning new ways to utilize that framing device. And I guess I would say this, is that there's no such thing as a museum or a perfect museum. The more I spend time with museums and museum audiences and curators and artists, the more I realize that every place is really, really different in its audience, its interaction, and its opportunity. And I think that's the way we need to think about it more, is the uniqueness of the particular circumstance.
Great. Richard, some recent museum buildings have not, or expansions, have not been wonderful for the art inside, as I mentioned earlier on. Yet, of course, architects, and you're one of them, want to make a striking, beautiful building that everybody's going to want to come and see from the outside as well. How do you reconcile that conflict as you're thinking about the museums that you're designing? How can architects design great buildings that are great for art?
Well, I say, first of all, an architect's got to have an understanding of and an appreciation for the art that's going to be in that museum. But probably more importantly, I think what Michael was just touching on is an understanding of the place, because every place is very different, and there are probably too many museums that look like they were called in on the phone by, that are of a particular style and that may not have to do with that place. So rather than talking about museums I don't like, architects are optimists, so I thought I might talk about a few that I really admire, and for different reasons. Has anybody been to the Louisiana Museum outside of Copenhagen? Okay, so to me this is kind of like a perfect museum, because it is a marriage of a great collection, an amazing site, and nature and light, all perfectly combined in a series of pavilions. You actually start in a 19th century mansion and then move through a series of pavilions through a garden, constantly having vistas and relationships, particular close relationships with art and with the garden and with the ocean, which is right there. And it's just it's a kind of magic place. So it's all of those things, not just about the collection, not just about the place, it's the way they're connected. If you've ever been to the Kunstmuseum in Basel, very different urban museum, but it's basically an enfilade set of small rooms around a courtyard, and each room, this is a collection-driven idea, each room is a different artist. So it's those Picasso, Braque, Gris, but each room, which has its own window and its own light, is totally dedicated to that artist. It's a very different idea. For instance, like what we did at the Anderson is completely a collection of post-war American art, but it's designed so that you can see across it, and it's informal. It's the opposite of that kind of sequence. So, and that seems to me to be much more a direction that we should be heading. But what I didn't mention is that what they all have in common is another thing, is that they all have those museums are very small in scale. And to me, the bigger challenge nowadays is that so many museums or directors or curators are asking for big space, and none of those ones I mentioned are big white boxes either, by the way, which is the sort of anathema. It's interesting, in the same thing in the theater world, the black box is the same kind of problem, I think. It has no character, no personality. It is not a bespoke thing made for an artist or made for a place. So that's there are new museums out there. The Whitney has this, is column-free from one side of the building to the other. The new Broad has the same kind of strategy. So, and maybe that's also because the nature of art has changed. It's not just about paintings and sculptures of a certain scale anymore. There are many, many different things that people are looking to do. So how do you do that at the same time? It seems to me that what's missing, and what many of those museums I didn't mention are lacking, is that human scale. I think that's the biggest challenge. Human scale.
Human scale. Okay, Jerry, you've been complaining about MoMA ever since it was erected. As I said, you're trying to unmake it. What's so bad about MoMA, and why particularly do you think it's bad for the art? Because I know you think the art is prime always.
Wait, I have to first just say, happy to talk about this, but when you called me, you said, would you talk about MoMA? You've written about MoMA. So I'm not like here.
Not
a
true. He
bad
suggested the
person.
question.
It's on demand.
Museums are ecstasy machines. We go there, we commune with the ancestors in silence. It's very uncanny what's going on in there. There's kids looking at a Malevich Square right now, like seeing whole new visionary worlds. And of course, the Museum of Modern Art is none other than our Garden of Eden. That collection, unrivaled and will be unrivaled in all likelihood for the rest of time, for the small period it collects, but collected better and deeper and wilder than anyone, is our Garden of Eden. It's where you're from, it's where I'm from. And when the 2004 building opened, I love MoMA. I can't live without it. Neither can you, but I have been oddly living without it. I don't mean everything is better in the old days. Everything wasn't better in the old days. I'm glad I wasn't there. I'm a Jew, I'd be killed. Or I'd own MoMA, maybe, or something. I don't know.
But be more specific, Jerry. What's wrong with it?
No one else got complained about. No. When the Taniguchi building was built, it gained exactly 30,000 square feet for the permanent collection before 1980. Think about that. The greatest collection on earth will be, always will be, was. That's about one Chelsea mega gallery bigger. At the same time, instead of the atavistic linear history that MoMA no longer wants to tell, that this man begat that male, begat that Jewish alcoholic, begat, another great artist. Nobody at MoMA is a sexist, racist, bad person. They are great people, I know them. They want to tell the story that looks more like spaghetti or something, where everything was happening everywhere all the time, but MoMA is now, because of this terrible oversight, confined to only install the masterpieces. And I would argue to you, again, I need those masterpieces, and again, if the admission is $25, you better get those masterpieces up there. I get that. But for God's sake, you can't tell how high a mountain is unless you have something to compare it to. I'm always struck by people that say, here I am on Annapurna. And it's just a little thing. You never know. You need comparison. What happens if you don't want, if it's not just masterpieces that feed you? Think about this. And now with MoMA's new building, they will not gain much more space for the permanent collection. I'm all for you guys building gorgeous space for new art. Great, yay, love it. I am it. I can't make my living without it, okay? That's what I write on. But at MoMA, you have a job. Real simple. Stupid. I'm not saying people are stupid. Build enough space for a...
That's your it.
Unbelievable. I thought one of you had your phone on.
You can have, no, that's me. So
Build enough space, and they didn't. They're not going
So
to
it's
by
more-
Diller, Scafidio, and Renfro. They're probably wonderful people. I'm done.
So Jerry, it's more the amount of space rather than the kind of space. But
No.
Richard, you talked
No.
also about the white box, the white cube, and Nicholas Penny, who was the stepping down director of the National Gallery in London, had this quote a little while back. He said, "These wings impress me as deadly." He's talking about MoMA. The same white walls with the same loud, large, obvious, instantly recognizable products lined up upon them. Nothing in the so-called academic institutions of the 19th century approached them in orthodoxy and predictability. Agree, disagree, discuss.
You know, I was thinking the other day that, first of all, I want to say my wife said to me the other day, I want my MoMA back.
Look, Betsy Ann.
Yeah.
She's here.
We
so
all
she-
do,
yeah.
and Whitney will return MoMA to
We're
us.
going
I'll
to get to
explain
Whitney
later.
in a minute.
But I was thinking about, I mean, why is there, something like Dia Beacon is fabulous. How many square feet is in?
300,000.
I mean, that's unbelievable. That is unbelievable. But it still has so much character. It has beautiful light, right? It has great floors. It feels good in there. Why is that? Okay, what's the difference? How hard is that to make that? The Guggenheim, when the Guggenheim was first built, there was a petition by a lot of famous artists that said this is the worst museum ever made, right? And then think about all the wonderful things that have happened in there because people artists are bouncing off of that building and saying, "What, I can do something incredible in here." It's the opposite of a white box. Think about James Turrell in there. It's unbelievable the things that have gone on in there. And it's really small. It's only 45 feet wide and 80 feet high. It's the smallest monumental space I can think of. So that building has personality. It's a tough personality,
so
but
we
it.
continue to see the white
know,
boxes.
yeah.
Michael, are you going to have any white boxes in the new LACMA?
We have a lot of white boxes.
Yeah,
we
you
just
do.
built some very flexible space so that curators, like a copied Dia Beacon in a new sense, so that curators could do what they wanted. But actually, the new building is, because it's a different problem when you have artists. In
Yeah.
fact, we started that program of commissioning artists in the 80s to make spaces for the Guggenheim on a large scale. And when you have artists, they can take anything and make something of it. So subjective spaces work quite well for a lot of artists. I think a little bit, Jerry, what you're talking about is when you want to see those larger stories, when you have different kinds of objects you need to accommodate, and probably you want to keep changing the story. And that does require more space. I think that one of the problems with the Taniguchi building was that its size, and it's this question of intimacy. There's a standard thinking that if something's small, it's intimate, but jam it with hundreds of people and you can't look over and around, it's not so intimate anymore. Whereas I remember when we were working on the Dia Beacon space with Robert Irwin, who's all about intimacy. He was the architect, he's an artist, and he's all about intimacy. And we were talking about the fact that being alone in a space or with 2 or 3 other people in a larger space can be intimate and it's not cold. But again, there's no one answer to it. But I think you're right, Jerry, that inability to wander. I mean, for me, I think the best feeling of a museum could be, and this is a little bit what we're trying to achieve, is that, I want to see museums. I want to walk through museums like you walk through a park. Like to experience the pure joy of that visuality of shifting perspectives. And I would love it if you didn't even have to know everything on your first. Do you need to know it's an oak tree on the first visit? No, you can come back and you should want to. And that's what's really important, is to want to come back, to want to be curious. And that's a hard thing to do in architecture. And the white cubes, again, white cubes have only been around for 35, 45 years. This is a tiny blip in the scheme of time of the history of museums.
So are they over, do you think, Susan? Do you think they're
Well,
over?
I guess, I don't know that they're over. I guess I'm a proponent of differently scaled spaces and spaces that can be particularized in some way so that you have that sense of unfolding and engagement, that you're moving through space in different ways and you discover differently scaled spaces and art within them. So I think that it's important to have different degrees of intimacy. So whether you're in a small space with a lot of people or a large space with a few people, it's all about how you engage with the space and others there. So I dealing with a traditional building where we have differently scaled galleries, to be able to expand upon that notion allows us some flexibility. And we have the big white cube as well, which was always divided up in order to accommodate more art.
Yeah.
So then what does that mean to have a large scale space that should be loft-like but was divided up with partitions because the curators wanted to put everything in that they could possibly see. So I think it's...
Okay, the Whitney's come up several times here. How many of you all been to the Whitney? Okay, great. But I'm still going to show 5 little slides. Can we have them, please? Oh, no? All right, so there we go. That's the Whitney Exterior. Here's a Whitney Gallery. That's, I think, the 7th floor right now. I'm not sure. Okay, another. One of the terraces and the view, obviously, and another terrace with artwork on it. It's gotten almost universal approval. I think the new Criterion didn't like it, but that was all. What is so great about the new Whitney, and how did it get so great? Go ahead, Jerry.
The Whitney, we live in New York City. New York City museum space, very different issues.
Right.
They're going to be crowded, but I love crowds. For God's sake, why not live? Why live there if you're not part of the crowd? The Whitney has figured out a way to cater to the crowds and to cater to art. The solution, the problem rather, was that. How can you build both? I'm going to say something that's going to sound mean to you, but I have no bad feeling about it. I think that much of the art world, the secret is we don't care much what the museums look like from the outside. Boom. We only care about the inside. I think that the new Whitney looks a little like a pharmaceutical headquarters. But
I agree.
But I love the new Whitney because it is now telling the story of its collection in a way it never has, where it's unfolding artists you and I have never seen, especially on those top 2 floors. That's the key. You guys want to show contemporary art? Again, I live it. I write on it. I'm for it. Build white boxes all you want. Just get the art, just get the collections and the art extremely near the front door, please, the 3 of you. Extremely near. You walk into the Met, boom, hello Egypt, how are you? And I love the Whitney, and I think the Whitney's going to help lead MoMA and its great, great, great staff.
So you said what's right about it, but how did it get there? How did it get to be so great? And I think Susan wants to talk and Richard wants to talk.
No, I just want to ask Richard a question because I worked on a building years ago, a museum building with Raphael Moneo, and his premise is to build from the inside out. And the exteriors of his buildings are criticized for being plain. But he worked with the art. He began with the collection and with the art, and then built out from that. And I think it's a very important premise upon which to build a vision of a museum. And I just wonder how architects respond to that mandate from a client, or is that a mandate that comes?
I can't imagine doing it any other way, personally. I mean, it seems a little crazy.
He's one of the good guys.
He is one of the good guys.
But,
except for one thing, he's good.
Whoa.
But
Is it bad? I've done a lot of bad things.
All right. So how did the Whitney get to be so good at managing the art, the crowds, and who cares
from the
about the
inside out.
outside?
I think one thing I've noticed is kind of a huge sigh of relief that everyone has let forth because it didn't come out like MoMA somehow. And it's my wife, again, I keep referring to her, said again, this is a really happy place. And I don't know what, she's right. It is something about it has a very relaxed vibe. The way you move around it is more informal. The elevator's very direct. Like you come in, which is the way the old Whitney was. The elevator was right there. And yeah, it's probably as unbuttoned as Renzo Piano's ever been in terms of the outside.
Okay, I think there's a different answer, but
But
maybe
it's
Michael
casual.
wants to give it to me.
First of all, MoMA was definitely designed from the inside out, so it doesn't guarantee success.
Yeah.
Right,
Process,
exactly.
right? They didn't
Exactly.
care at all
That's
what
true.
the outside
That's
looked
true.
like. They worked with the collection with models.
Yeah.
Worked out. But I think that, actually, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Jerry, I'm interested in, because of the New York City issue, this urban crunch, and the fact that art keeps getting bigger and artists keep making things for whatever reason.
Bigger.
Do you just keep getting bigger, or there's a lot of discussion about sort of splitting up the museum, looking at outposts and
I worry
obviously
about
we did that at
outposts very much,
right.
Michael.
Yes,
Very
that's why I
much,
want you to
for
answer that,
obvious
because I know
reasons.
that.
Very simply, I think we're living through a very brief period when there's more money for more artists in more museums and more space than has ever existed, possibly ever. And this period will end, like all periods end. I find myself personally getting a little tired of huge things, like wondering, what is this for, who's this for? I don't have an answer for you. Again, if all of you want to build big spaces, just leave our collections, let them live.
Yeah.
Let them live. And again, this off-site thing worries me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Although the Whitney, I hope, does all of you, just give a lot of money so they can buy that meat packing building.
Okay,
next
come
to
on,
it
Jerry. All right,
and
now,
be the best museum
there's
in the
another
world.
answer, I think, to the question I posed. And Michael, I'm going to put you
Michael,
on the
we can
spot a
summarize.
little bit because from all I've read, one of the reasons that Whitney has been so successful is that the architect and the curators really worked together on the spaces. And there was a lot of give and take. Curators making, I don't know whether you'd call them demands, but wish lists and things like that with Renzo. So the reason I'm going to put you on the spot is because I know the Zumthor plan is really very in its early stages, but a couple of the critics have said, and there's been no curator involvement, it's all been a secret process. So you're the perfect person to answer the, no, you don't have to defend yourself, but talk about curator involvement with architecture.
Yeah, again, I think every situation is so different depending on what you're doing it for. There was a lot of curator involvement in MoMA. I mean, very, very strong
Were
involvement.
there artists?
Maybe they were bad curators.
Were there artists?
Lots and lots of artists? I don't know.
No, I don't think so many artists because that space wasn't really, they were just the white cube for that. So I don't know if that's really an
Maybe it was
issue
the
or a
nature of the
formula.
curators.
It would depend who. We all
Yeah.
know that no building gets built well without a good client. And I think, again, in every situation, that structure is different depending on the need. Are you building it for a particular collection? It doesn't change. You know, Dia Beacon was very much, it was very intimate with the artists involved, the curator and the director and the artist architect. And every screw was placed precisely in discussion, right? But where museums are made to be rotating things, you're really making them for the curators of the future and the artists of the future. So that's a very different problem. I mean, I think there's a nice matter-of-fact quality to the Whitney. And I mean, my thing is, don't overthink it. Like, there's a nice matter-of-fact quality. In fact, that space, I colonized that space. That was supposed to be Dia's space before I left
Yes, you
New
did.
York.
Yes,
and the
you
whole
did.
idea was, it was kind of cool because it was open on the
Away.
river. There was small streets to walk in. You could see the place changing. And then there was the Highline Park. And then if you just built something that had a more industrial, simple feel, what I would call the matter-of-factness, which is maybe, Jerry, a little bit what you're after, that simplicity of, you know, the art's right there. And the space is quite simple as a frame. And I think that is successful. And Renzo Piano is very good at that sometimes.
And it really,
Go ahead.
it really engages the city. You know, it's a high-rise building, really. But the way I'm waiting to see what happens in the wintertime because the sequence down the stairs is fabulous. In the summertime,
There are no
it's going to be so
vestibules. By the way,
fabulous
there are
and
no
snowing.
vestibules.
Yeah, no vestibules. Yeah.
Just quickly, I know you have mostly university museums, but in your experience, Richard, have curators been involved and at what point?
Well, like at Yale, you know, there are 18 curators. I mean, Yale has a collection that is
This is for
unbelievable.
his Yale building.
Okay,
come
thank
on.
you, Jerry. But I mean, it's like the Met, just a little smaller. You
Yeah.
know? I mean, it's 3,000 years of incredible art. And in fact, the temporary space is all the way. It's like the department store strategy. It's all the way at the other end of the
right.
building.
Way up there.
So you have to go through the collection
You
to
can't
get to
find
it. You can't not. Yeah. You can't not. So it's a teaching museum. So that
Yeah.
is the reason for.
Different,
But
yeah.
all those curators, I mean, we had to spend a lot of time. You know, I want my baseboard this big, and well, that's not going to work for me. I want mine this big. You know, floorboards, colors, you know, lighting. A lot of time spent about this collection. You know, Greek and Roman looks great in the Romanesque building, and you know, Asian looks great in the Kahn building. And you know, there's a lot of conversation about where to put collections. And then through all of it is Jock Reynolds, who was the greatest client, who was the one who had heard all the cats and say, you know, okay, now that we're all done talking about your baseboard and yours, this is the way we're going to do it.
Okay.
So.
Okay, I'm going to go to change things to one of the museums I think everybody agrees is a bad building for art. You've been to the Denver Art Museum, it's called the Hamilton Building. But that's what
This
it
is
looks
where
on
you
the
never want to be
outside.
on a slideshow.
And this is what it looks on the inside. It's very hard to hang a show in there. This is the lightning round. To each one of you, one by one. Do you think that maybe Libeskind helped tip it? The balance has moved away from the architecture statement museum. Yes or no, Jerry?
He's just a terrible architect.
Yeah, that's
Except for a private house I've seen of his. He was just symptomatic. a symptom that actually helped cause the disease, but he's not responsible.
Well, what was the disease? Isn't it architecture?
The American night.
I don't know. All right, Richard,
I mean,
have we moved
big.
away from the State Museum?
Our marketing people the other day did a little analysis and came up out of 170, I don't know where they found this out, 170 museums in the last 15 years. 75 of them are by 5 architects.
All men?
Renzo Piano, who did half of them probably,
Yes,
right?
yeah. He did about 30, yeah.
Right, yeah. Herzog and Numeron, David Chipperfield, Tadeo Ando, how many is that? I have
4.
one more.
It's a sausage fest.
Oh, Stephen Hall. So,
Stephen Hall is
yeah,
in the top
and so
5.
the rest of us have done, 1 or 2 or something, but these guys, that's the
interesting.
issue. Is like
Well, Stephen Hall
those
made
guys
a
are
nice
doing.
building at the Nelson Atkins. I think that's a great building for art. You don't like it?
Oh my God. It's bigger than, I love it from the outside. It's pretty. It looks like a convention center. I'm sorry if he's all your friends, but you have to walk more than 200 yards to get to the first art, and not 1 square foot of
The
the
Nelson
space
Atkins?
that you're in
No.
is usable for art.
The Nelson Atkins?
Yeah.
We're talking about the same building?
Kansas,
It's
effing
true.
City.
Yeah.
I
I
love
think the
you,
whole building
Kansas
is great.
City. I'm a Midwest kid.
Oh my gosh. All right.
Sure.
We disagree on that one, Jared. Michael, is architect over or not?
But if you take the list that was just given, a lot of trustees are hiring Renzo Piano because he's a starchitect, but he supposedly gives
Listens.
the art its due, and it's quite simple.
Well,
but I just want to say, this bad building, bad architect, we can all agree in this particular case. But Zaha Hadid just made a very beautiful building in Michigan State, which has angular walls. And it's just fantastic. On the outside, it looks like a constructionist
she's an
toaster.
artist.
But Maxie's not very good
Huh?
for art, right? Maxie, the one in Rome,
In Rome
that
is
she
tough.
did.
I'm
Works
I'm
for
not,
you?
again, with
Boom.
contemporary artists who are putting work there, and curators who can always make a new show. It's just an example where you don't have to have a box. Like
Yeah.
Zaha's building is really beautiful. I know the curators and students really like it. It's the Eli Broad Museum there, and it's so. I don't think there's a formula, and I don't think that there's a trend either, because for as
Either.
many people
Fair enough.
are hiring Frank Gehry, we're still renovating factories. So.
Okay. Okay, Susan, you want to say anything, or else I'm going
I-
to go to the audience?
I
Next
just,
question.
the only thing I want to say is that it really is the client that begins
Totally.
to drive this process. And if you have a starchitect, you can see what happens when there's an engaged client with Renzo Piano's building at the Whitney
And
versus others that are just steps away from the
Exactly.
client's vision.
Okay, great. So, questions from the audience, and I'm reminded to ask you to wait for the microphones to come on down when you're ready to ask the question. There's one here in the second row. Can you get to him? Is that you, Pepe? Right here. And then we'll go to the lady over here. So if you could come down here also to the second row, she'll be next. Yes.
No, not yet. Hi.
That's Pepe Carmel, a great art critic and historian.
So I have a question for Michael and Susan, picking up on what Jerry was saying. Both of you mentioned in one way or another reconfiguring the approach to the permanent collection. And I have to say, this makes me nervous. I went a couple of years ago to Tampa, where they had torn down their old museum and put up an aluminum box that has a fantastic party space on the ground floor and cavernous galleries on the second floor for contemporary art. And the permanent collection, which is one of the country's greatest collections of Greek ceramics, was compressed from a whole series of galleries into one room. How do we keep this from happening?
I was saying the opposite.
I was too.
It's the opposite.
You're going to put more
That-
emphasis
that
on
we-
the
From-
permanent?
yeah.
that the collections have been pushed back a little bit, party spaces, exhibitions, and other things. And I think what we're saying, and I don't know what is the opposite, is that
Yeah.
the collections have to be forward, present, active. They have to, again, define museums in the way that they did in the old days. Not that, again, that the old days were always better, but that is, I think the trend in thinking now is push the collections out there, central, and probably make them more active for the reason that Jerry's saying, is that you just can't make the story of white male artists anymore. There are different audiences, and you have to tell stories in different ways, because one way to tell the story of art history, for example, even colonial Mexico, do you connect it to the US, do you connect it to Europe, or do you connect it to Asia? The answer is you can do it all 3 ways. and you should do it different ways at different times so that different stories can be told. But I think it's the opposite.
Yeah, and that was my point, that we're actually dedicating more space to the permanent collection and pushing it forward. So the programs of the 80s and 90s of museums where you had to have a retail space and a restaurant open onto the street, which many museums still do, is there's a third way, which is to engage the collections immediately. So you have that at the point of access. And reconfiguring the collections just for me means to have the curators talking to each other more so that they're integrating painting, sculpture, decorative arts, photography, telling a story that may be one part of a larger historical narrative, but is a story that's complete unto itself. So it's not there is still a sequence or a pockets of strength, but it's about telling a fuller story, engaging that conversation, whether it's colonialism or it's Spanish, Spanish influences, or there are just many ways to do it.
Okay, the lady with the microphone.
I was wondering if what your take on the new Clark Museum up in Williamstown is, and especially relative to the money and space and everything that's devoted to everything but the art. Or the balance, maybe the
That's a
balance
neutral question.
between directors.
That's not a setup.
I didn't plan that.
Did he design the Clark?
No.
You did?
No.
No,
Ando.
Ando did.
Ando.
Okay, will you pass the microphone back? Pass the microphone back to the next person. Okay. Sorry, who wants to answer that?
I haven't been inside.
been.
I have been outside, which I thought was spectacular. Actually, I had lunch by
I
the
think
pool.
the premise of the project was more than, it was about creating a campus that was an integrated campus that included study spaces, the academic center, and gallery spaces. But I don't think it was solely a way to enhance the collection. So I think within that context, it's been successful, and the landscape is spectacular.
Also, the new space was for special exhibitions at the Clark. The rest of the building, where the permanent collection is, was renovated by Annabelle Seldorf, and I think it looks terrific,
Yeah.
except for the marvelous mauve color of the main gallery. But the rest of it, I think, looks terrific for the permanent
But what's
collection.
really, I have been, as I said, outside. What's really great is the completely reordered entry sequence.
The orientation.
You come around the other way than you used to, and that whole
Yeah.
is very carefully orchestrated by Ando, and it's beautiful.
And-
You go down
and
that
with
big wall
Reed
and
Hildebrand.
see the water and the mountain. I mean,
Talk about a hike.
it's great. But then the temporary gallery's in the basement.
But I also think that's an example of a great
know.
collaboration between Ando and Reed Hildebrand, the
Yeah.
landscape.
Oh, yeah, there.
Yeah.
Because they worked so well together to create those sequences.
Yeah.
According to the criteria we just set, which was spend your money on art space and make it bigger for art, the Clark is a lot of money for very little art space, and it's for all the ancillary spaces.
Right,
However,
a
Jerry,
campus.
to the point of working from the inside out, audiences are changing. Not everybody knows what's inside a museum who's going to visit a museum. And so making a very open, friendly, direct entrance and environment that doesn't scare people away. I mean, the Clark's different because it's a destination, but we have to remember we can't just throw out all we've learned about the invitation in terms of entrance, and that's so key. It can't just be the gallery.
Yeah.
And that's what they were
Go ahead and actually just let me recall what the two of you said earlier in your first answer. Susan, you said we're now conveners. And Michael, you said, well, just that museums are changing their functions. So we should talk a little bit more about this and what it means for the architecture.
I wanted
Shouldn't
to
we
follow
keep
up on
the
that
audience?
conversation.
Well, we will. I've got a question coming sooner, but
I wanted to follow up on Michael's point about welcoming and grace and engagement, because we have a very traditional building, which you saw, with a grand front porch and steps leading up. And we have this, as to the point of convening, we have a lot of activities on that front porch, and a lot of artists who perform there and who engage with the public. And I was talking to someone yesterday, and it's a very, about the city of New Orleans, and how the front porch in New Orleans is a great organizer of community and neighborhoods, and people sit on the porch and they talk and they drink a lot and have food, and it's all about convening people for a common interest, and that is kind of what is happening by making that space accessible and available. So it is welcoming.
did you have something to say? Because then, okay, I want to ask one. So one other thing, I will get to you in 1 second. While we're on the talk of openness and entry to, there's this, I think, canard going around in museum architecture that young people are intimidated by walking up the steps of the Brooklyn Museum and the Metropolitan. They find Beaux-Arts architecture very intimidating, which led to the redoing of the opening of the Brooklyn Museum, which I think most people agree is kind of a disaster. So what is with this myth that old buildings do not seem inviting to people of all ages?
It depends on how old they are.
Are they not inviting? You have to tear down your Beaux-Arts building?
No, you have to make it accessible and available and inviting, not necessarily by changing the physical space, but by bringing them in. And we have a program for 3- and 4-year-olds who come to the museum. They are fearless. They walk in the door, they stand in the hall, they drag their parents in. The parents are afraid. But they have no fear. They have no filter. They have no experience with that kind of space. So I would say no.
Okay, great. That's a good answer.
Thank
We'll
you.
go
She
to the
likes
lady in the green. I can't see it. Is it Catherine?
Yes, I'm Catherine Heald. I'm an Asiaphile, and I'm just wondering what you think, any of you think of Naoshima Island by Tadao Ando in Japan.
I'd love to go there. I haven't been yet.
Me neither.
Where is it?
It's in,
It's in Japan.
it's not far from
offshore.
Noguchi's studio, where Mr. Fukutake made a museum started with a museum. He had a collection, and then he made a museum for 3 artists, James Turrell, Walter de Maria, and Claude Monet, and had Tadao Ando make very specific spaces so that it was a destination. He also had Tadao Ando build the hotel. What's unique about it when it was first made is the artworks, the famous high price he paid for the Bruce Nauman neon. The idea was to put the art in the hotel and make this a destination. And actually it works fairly nicely. It accommodates a few people. One of the nicest things about that project that doesn't get photographed as often is there's a small village, and many of the works of art are actually in the village. So Tadao Ando made a beautiful burnt, charred wood traditional building with a dark James Turrell light space inside. So it's a very great experiment in this idea of a destination in a small environment that works very well.
Okay, while I'm waiting for more questions, another quick lightning round, starting with Susan. Just a minute. The best building other than your own for art?
The Louisiana.
Michael?
I like the Kimball.
That's what I was
We
gonna
all
say.
like the Kimball.
Yeah, it's very good.
The Kimball, the
The
old
Kimball.
Kimball or the new Kimball?
The only
Old
yeah, the
Kimball.
old
Kimball, thank you. Okay, Jerry?
Right away, I thought the Parthenon, is that the one with the hole? No, the
Pantheon.
Pantheon.
That's the greatest interior space I've ever been.
For art?
There are paintings.
There's paintings
Yeah.
for art. Because I'm an art critic on a weekly deadline, I don't leave my zip code much. I'm not complaining, so I haven't seen that many. I apologize.
Okay. Question over here. No, wait a minute. Lady in the back, and then you, Dwight, next. Yes, you.
Have any of you been to Indochine in Brazil?
Yeah, the park of contemporary art.
No.
Well, but it's also different pavilions of architecture. Some of them permanent, some of them not. Changing
She's working on that right here. Amy Capolazzo is right there
all
working
right.
on this,
Well,
aren't
she's
you?
at the next panel, though, so stay for the next panel. Okay.
Yeah.
Up here, second row.
Crowdsourcing.
Next.
Dwight Lee, given the appreciation or the advancement in the cost of art and the acceleration in the cost of both building and maintaining buildings, I'm curious on your thoughts about university and college art museums, their sustainability, their role.
Yeah.
Richard, do you want to answer first? I think all of us could answer.
I'm not sure I understand the question entirely. I mean, I can tell you, like the one at Stanford that we just did, Stanford has always had a museum. It's actually one of the original buildings of the university from 1895, but it never had some famous collection. It's not like Yale or Harvard or somewhere. So the Anderson collection kind of vaults them into a much higher rank all of a sudden, even though it is only 121 works of art. But I can tell you that it has radically changed that campus, and the reason for it is the president believes strongly, because he's also built a concert hall, building a new studio art building, and there will be a music building soon. Because Stanford is all about engineering and, and computer science and et cetera, and there isn't any of that. And now it has really, and it's all right up front, right as you enter the main campus, and that is like, it's a kind of earth-shaking thing there, literally, for them to,
I think if I might just say something, I think university museums are growing in importance to the populace at large.
And I think there are two major issues. One is the university leadership and how it responds to the role of the museum in the academy, in the academic field. The second is the engagement of the University Museum with not only art history, but other disciplines. And so when you take on the notion of an interdisciplinary model and you reach the engineers and the scientists and those people who can infuse the museum with different ideas and a different life, then it takes on a completely different role in the university. But it's imperative also, I mean, they're training the next generation of museum goers. We would like to say philanthropists and makers and visitors. So you have to think about it in those terms as well.
Okay, we have time for two more questions. One of them, Judy, I think you have one, right? No, sorry. Who's got the microphone back there? Okay. Yeah, sorry.
Can you stand up or no? I don't know what it's like.
We only have
Kathleen
6 seconds.
O'Grady, I'd like to ask you how you feel about the vanity museums that are popping up all over and how that's impacting on your ability to collect and how that changes museums for the future.
Well, very quickly I'll say the Rubels, Thea Westreich and her husband,
Ethan Wagner.
Ethan Wagner.
I'm happy if you do build a vanity museum or you don't. But I really hope that your kids will give all that art to one of our museums. Because otherwise it all ends up at auction and everybody applauds the trillion-dollar prices and you will never see this again. One other quick note, it is already extraordinary that the Westreich collection went to the Whitney partly because they built space this is 500 works of art, partly because they built an accommodating, not enough exactly, but enough and accommodating space. That's what I think of.
Okay, any other views?
Well, there is a trend right now, given the wealth that's been accumulated and this idea that we live in an age of very powerful individuals. 30 years ago, it was corporations that were powerful. Now it's the individuals who have the wealth, and they don't like to play ball sometimes with the messy process of public museums. But there have been private museums and vanity museums really from the beginning of time. So it's not a new phenomena.
The Vatican.
I think we need both. There's nothing wrong with having an ecosystem of both. If the vanity museums draw all the energy, suck all the energy out of the public museums, which they haven't yet, that would be a bad situation, only because there's a different decision-making process and different audiences are addressed. But I have no fear that that's going to happen right now. The world's big enough for all of them.
And to Jerry's point, I think just it's truly critical that a family that makes a decision like that allows there to be an endowment that carries it forward, because it is a commitment to a point of view and a public face that really needs to be sustained. So if it all falls apart and ends up on the auction block, I'm not sure that's a win-win for anyone.
Okay, is there one last question? Yes, right here.
Terry Childs, presumably the audience for art has changed since my youth. I used to go full of passion, walk in, see the art, and was awestruck. And today, I have a feeling that you have to go out and grab people by the neck and bring them in. And maybe that's an excuse for that museum. And it's not that he's a bad architect, but that the board of the museum asked for something that was going to go out and grab somebody. And I say that to Michael because you're in, in the stage of building.
It's a good question. I mean, audiences are growing in large metropolitan museums. So we're seeing more and more people utilize museums. A lot of those are tourists who are seeing the cultural attraction. But it is true in an internet age, and this is talked about a lot, that if the art isn't well presented, if there isn't an invitation and it isn't a decent place to be, like Jerry not going to MoMA anymore.
I go. I go there more than all of you.
You're kicking and
40
screaming.
times a year, I go.
But it is more and more important that the environment be a satisfactory experience.
But
We are finding that.
But the other thing is that there are many different audiences now. There are
very
different kinds of
rapidly
audiences. So and you have to, I think it's also about program. You have to address the challenge of the family visitor, the young visitor, the visitor who's only interested in Chinese art, who's only interested in Indian art. There are these different constituencies, all of whom come together around the idea that the museum has a place and purpose in a
Believe it or
city.
not, I'm going to let Jerry have the last word, but first I want to have a little quick word. And that is, but don't forget the people who really want to be serious and have one-on-one corrections. I mean, confrontations with art.
You can do both.
There are only
There's
four
no
of us,
reason.
but anyway, go ahead, Jerry.
there's
You
no
have the
reason not
last
to do
word.
it. You can do both.
I don't want to be a loudmouth, but I just had an idea while you guys were speaking. What happens if we didn't think so much about that? If we build it, they will come.
Yeah.
The art brought us, it will bring others.
Mm-hmm.
If the building is ugly or beautiful or not, or fun and exciting. That was just a thought.
We didn't plan that, but isn't it a great ending? So thank you all very much. I think you're a great panel, you're a great audience.